Hello and welcome to this short video exploring recent work by the Strategy Unit funded by NHS England to help better understand the scale, trends and regional variations of potentially mitigable hospital activity, national and subnational levels. This suite of reports explains the methods used to classify acute activity as potentially mitigable, developed as part of the Strategy Unit's work on a new hospital programme. To help set the context for the work is my colleague at the Strategy Unit and its director, Peter Spilsbury. Welcome, Peter.
Hi. Hi, James.
Hi. And let's start with total potentially mitigable activity. A bit of a mouthful, but let's just explore what that means and also the purpose of these reports.
Yeah, okay. Well, the origin of the work for the new hospitals programme comes about because when you're thinking about building a hospital for the future, you can think about how much demand is going to change because of changes in the population, the size and the makeup of the population. But also you want to think about ways in which you might change the provision of services such that it results in different levels of utilisation of hospital resources. And sometimes this all gets lumped together under the rather possibly unhelpful term of the left shift. But it's a critical consideration that goes on as part of any kind of planning exercise for the future. So for the new hospitals programme, we needed to codify the types of activity that were potentially avoidable, because one of the objectives was to have a standardised approach. Now, over the years, the Strategy Unit's built up a library of evidence and methods that are deployed in this country and elsewhere that people use to try and identify elements of activity that could potentially be avoided. And so we curated all of these, added a few ourselves, and there's now like 90 categories of activity, some very large, some small, where there is at least some published evidence to suggest that some of that activity could be potentially avoided through a number of different mechanisms. And we also, as it happens, try to classify them by these mechanisms. So sometimes it's through prevention, sometimes it's through substitution. You provide a service in a different, just the same service, but you locate it somewhere else that's maybe a less expensive environment. Sometimes through a sort of reduction of intensity of activity through either because of early intervention or whatever. Some of those mechanisms apply within the hospital only. So, increasing day case rates or whatever. Some of them require action elsewhere in the system to bring them about. And that's the left shift element. Now, what you can't do at the moment, whether you ever could is a debatable question, but at the moment the evidence base is simply not strong enough to precisely identify activity that can be avoided. But what you can do through all the evidence that we've amassed is you can say within certain cohorts of activity, a proportion of that can be avoided, and that's the potentially mitigable. The other thing, perhaps just to log at the beginning, which is important, is when you look at it through the lens of individual cohorts, the cohorts cross over. So a cohort of activity that's potentially avoidable because it's about emergency admissions of the frail elderly may cross over or intersect with the cohort that's about falls reduction or a cohort that's about medicines management. Now we handle that within the model because by operating the model at a patient record level. So we avoid the risk of double counting effect, which is a real risk, and we've seen many plans in the past where people have double counted effect, but we avoid that. But so what you can't do is you can't look at the potentially mitigable activity in each of these 90 cohorts and add it all together and say, that's the total. It requires a more sophisticated calculation than that.
So what you've described, there are lots of dynamics to this. So folks watching this video, where could they find the definitions that involves, but also that evidence base that you mentioned that underpins them?
Yeah. So one of the fundamental disciplines of how we've approached the new hospital modelling exercise is it's all fully documented, and all of that documentation is in the public domain. The model itself is open sourced. So for every one of these categories, and you'll be able to access it through links that are in these reports, there is a full set of definitions. There is the evidence base that we've used to underpin it. There's all the code that we've used to identify the relevant cohort in the activity, because in some instances the cohort requires itself, the population it relates to is quite precisely defined, as well as the subset of activity that you then go searching for. So that's all in there for anyone who wants it, and it's all available for others to pick up and use, because it's all in open source, as I say.
And there's a lot here, isn't there, about assumptions and mitigations. And from this work, what would you say are some of the sort of typical assumptions that people make regarding, I suppose, the extent of that mitigation that they could achieve?
Yeah. So there's a few things I'd like to just bring out about that. So one of the ways we've approached the modelling for the new hospitals programme, which this particular report rides on the back of, is that we've approached it as an exercise in probabilistic forecasting. Partly because that's good practice. That's what the government says should happen for large-scale programmes. But it's also because actually a high level of uncertainty about levels of mitigation is the most reasonable position to adopt, given the current state of the evidence. So when we work with a local system or a group of people to think about what assumption they might make about what proportion of the potentially mitigable activity could be achieved by when, we ask them to think about the level of uncertainty they have around that. So the first thing to register is that we see very high levels of uncertainty. Even when we ask a group of people to think about this, imagining that they're in an unconstrained resources environment, even in that assumption, there's still quite a high level of uncertainty, because some of the uncertainty is about the fundamental theory about whether this activity could be avoided or not. There's then another level of uncertainty that's about, will we have the resources, will we have the organisational systems that allow us to realise it? So there's a high level of uncertainty. But then when we ask people to think about what proportion of these categories they think could be realised, then you're typically seeing organisations settling on somewhere between 10 and 25% of it varies obviously by situation, but it's that kind of end of the spectrum rather than 90%. We never see anyone say they could get that, actually. Even in the resource unconstrained scenario, the highest that we saw people saying they thought they could achieve was up to about 50% for some of the categories. Now, one of the things we want to create over time is to build a library of the assumptions that people are making. We've got it for the 18 new hospital schemes that have gone through, and we do see quite significant variation by place, some of which is to do with where they start from, some of which is to do with their local context, some of which is to do with the fact that, as I said, the evidence is currently not very substantial. So people are having to make judgments. These are judgments that come out of a deliberative process. You can't go and look it up in a table somewhere and say that. So anyway, so it's that kind of thing. So it's very important that people don't think that the potentially mitigable activity in total, that anyone is saying all of that could come out of hospital. Nobody's saying that. What they're saying is a proportion of it possibly could, and at the moment we're still in the territory where there's quite a high level of uncertainty about what proportion of that could be realistically achieved. But hopefully going forward, if we're more rigorous in how we evaluate things, then maybe we'll start to be able to refine that evidence base.
Well, Peter, that brings me nicely to my kind of final question, which is sort of in taking this forward, what is next for this work? Because there's a lot of work been done. There's a big volume of things that will come from this. So what do you see as coming next?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just I've realised I just need to explain why done for this report. So for the New Hospitals Programme, we were looking at how much might you reduce the size of the future hospital, having made some assumptions about some elements of the activity being avoidable. What we were doing for this particular report is saying, well, if we think about these categories of potentially avoidable activity, potentially mitigable activity, we can use that to compare across the country what the current rates are and what the recent trends have been. So this is trends in the total volume of activity in each of these categories that are potentially mitigable. And the reason why we think that that's useful is two things, really. One, we think that in some instances it might help people think about how to target local efforts around the left shift, because they might see that they're a high outlier or a lower outlier against the general picture across the country for some of these categories. Or they might see that recent trends have had them moving in an opposite direction to the others. So that's potentially useful. But the other fundamental proposition is about how do we measure going forward whether, as an NHS, locally or nationally, we are succeeding in delivering the hospital to community, one of the three national missions set by the Secretary of State. Because the problem with avoided activities, you can't measure avoided activity. It's a known unknown. You can infer, you can do comparisons against match controls if you set the thing up like that. You can ask a group of clinicians to look at case notes and reach a judgment about whether a particular case would or wouldn't have been admitted in different circumstances. There's things you can do, but you can't measure avoided activity by definition. But what you can measure is whether you're changing the total volume of categories that are potentially mitigable. So our proposition for this work is it sets a way to track whether people are gaining any inroads into the left shift. Because if we're achieving the left shift, we should see the total volume of activity in these potentially mitigable cohorts starting to reduce. Because it's from within those that we know the left shift will occur from within those categories if it occurs at all. So that's a basic proposition. So going forward, picking up your question about what's next. So one thing that's what's next is we think this is an analysis that needs to be repeated or maybe even built into a sort of routinely updated report as part of that prospective tracking. We would like to continue to build up a library of the kinds of assumptions that people are making about each of these categories, so we can all start to get some sense of where we sit against the assumptions of our peers. But then thirdly, and possibly most important of all really, is we really want to try to help galvanise a national effort, or another national mission. It's a fourth mission, actually, I'd suggest to the Secretary of State, which is, for heaven's sake, this time, if we're going to try and deliver some of these community alternatives, let's make sure that we do the evaluation at a sufficient level of sophistication that we can create an evidence base that allows us to refine the definition of potentially mitigable activity. Because in some categories at the moment, it's really quite broad. And it would help hugely if we could narrow some of those definitions down. And that will only happen if we collectively agree that we're going to stop celebrating advertorial case studies and start celebrating robust impact evaluation. done in reproducible analytical pipeline style, so that we can all believe it and use it as a decent basis for onward decision making.
Okay, for now, Peter, thank you. Now I'm joined by Sarah Lucas, who is one of our healthcare analysts here at the strategy unit. Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
Good to get you on. And we're going to talk now really about I suppose, this kind of structure of the report and a number of things that are in the suite of reports in more detail. And I think we're going to start with, I suppose, trying to understand the scale of the activity nationally, because there are lots of different levels, I think, in terms of the analysis within the report itself.
Yeah, there is. So the report actually contains data for 29 different mitigators. So for each of those mitigators within the report, which are down the side, there's a summary in terms of national activity. So we provide it for each individual mitigator, but also these mitigators can be grouped according to the mechanism by which the mitigation is thought to occur. So we have these 4 different mechanism groups as well. And for each one of those, we provide a summary for all the mitigators within that group. So we have these 4 mechanism groups, one for efficiencies, which are mitigators that are concerned with reducing length of stay. So they're not about reducing the number of admissions, just about the number of bed days. We have a group that's efficiencies and relocation. So that basically includes your virtual wards. We then have a mechanism group for prevention. So that's more public health related mitigators. So it's concerned with initiatives around reducing smoking, alcohol consumption, obesity. And then our final group is a redirection substitution group. So those are mitigators which are about moving hospital activity to more community services, either new or existing services. So we have those 4 summaries, but then in addition to that, we have an overall summary page as well at the start of the report, and that includes data for all 29 of those mitigators summarised together.
Now, Sarah, there's lots of information in these reports and this report, but helpfully, I think there's a sort of common format, isn't there? There's some commonality in terms of how this information's laid out.
Yeah, there is. So we can actually kind of go through an example, and you'll see the layout is pretty much the same for all of the other mitigators.
Okay, and another aspect, I guess, for folks to consider is how we sort of understand the characteristics and how they're grouped and what those cohorts look like within the report.
Yeah, so we start off with a descriptive analysis, and that kind of gives that breakdown of who it is that's in each cohort, in terms of demographic characteristics, but also in terms of admission characteristics as well, so specialty, length of stay. And it can be helpful as well if you want to kind of look at whether a certain group within that cohort is over or underrepresented. So, for example, are those in more deprived areas over or underrepresented within the cohort? And one thing you will notice as you go through the report is for almost all of the mitigators, we're showing both admissions and bed days. So there's 2 tabs for each of these so that you can switch between the 2. Although for the efficiency mitigators, because those are only focused on reducing length of stay, not preventing admissions, we only show bed days for those mitigators.
Now, there's an important point as well, I think, that we should flag around, and I guess the issue of potential duplication in terms of people considering how they mitigate things and which mitigators they might apply. Yeah,
so there is this potential issue with duplication and a risk when you look at the mitigators of double counting, because many of the admissions and the bed days will fall into multiple mitigator cohorts. And so we do have this section on cohort overlap to kind of try and help you understand how these mitigators are overlapping. So we have various different charts, and we show how many different cohorts a particular mitigator is in. We show which cohorts are overlapping, and then we show the degree of overlap between the different cohorts. It's probably also important to mention here that when we show summaries, so for our 4 mechanism summary pages and the overall summary, we've removed that duplication. So the values that we give in that, each admission and each bed day is only counted once.
And a lot of our colleagues watching this will be, I think, interested in how they perhaps compare with other ICBs and other areas in England and the England average. So how might they use something like this to consider that part of it?
Okay, so the second half of the analysis kind of covers this. So we have a comparative analysis section where you can compare different ICBs using the most recent year of data. So if you're going to make comparisons, obviously the age and sex standardised rates for the ICBs are going to probably be most useful, because obviously it will take into account differences in population structure in the different areas. So we show those, but in addition, we do also show the absolute number and the percentage of activity as well, just because these can kind of give some further insights. For example, they might flag up areas where a particular type of service might be in high demand, perhaps because of the makeup of the population. If you've got an older population, then some services might be in higher demand within that area. So we show this for ICB, but we do also within this section have a breakdown that goes down to the level of local authority. So if you do want to compare local authority areas, you can also do that.
That's really clear. There's lots of information in there. There's lots of things that I think importantly people can dip into in terms of it being interactive and, you know, not just being a static report, which is really helpful. And I guess another aspect of this is people will want to look at how that activity is changing perhaps over time and what kind of, I suppose, impact improvements are having in terms of you know, some of that potential and some of that mitigation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a trends section within the analysis which shows that. What we do is we start by giving the trends for England overall. And then we move on to also give a breakdown at the level of ICB, including showing a summary of the percentage change over the last 5 years within each ICB. So something that's kind of interesting within this section is actually, if you look at both the admissions and the bed days, you can kind of get some useful insights into the data from comparing the two. So what we've seen is that in some ICB areas, the number of admissions is actually falling, but the number of bed days is increasing. So that obviously suggests that the area is perhaps being successful at reducing the number of short stay admissions. But actually, when people are admitted, they appear to be staying for longer, perhaps because they're more complex. And so that might indicate that the current strategies in the area might need to be reviewed, and that perhaps the balance of managing some of these patients isn't quite right at the moment. So in addition to just looking at the trends themselves, we do also provide another section in order to compare how ICBs are performing, and that's these quadrant charts. So these take into account the level of activity that the ICB started at 5 years ago, because obviously those that had a higher starting rate will be easier for them to decrease potentially. So what this chart is showing is the percentage change over the last 5 years relative to the standardised rate of activity in 2018-2019. So those ICBs that fall in this lower left quadrant of the chart, those are the ICBs that started at a relatively low rate 5 years ago and have since managed to decrease their rate even further. So these could kind of be considered some kind of well-performing ICBs, those that fall within this lower quadrant. And again, here within the trend section, we do break the data down to the level of local authority. So again, you can look at that level of geography as well.
Now, Sarah, there are lots of potential areas, I guess, where this analysis could be applied, and there's lots in here that people can usefully apply. But there are some pitfalls, I think, that we should probably flag, because there are things that people perhaps should be wary of when they come to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So some things we've kind of touched on, which is that it's kind of important when looking at it to remain conscious that the mitigator cohorts do overlap, because obviously that brings some additional complexity when you're looking at this. But also we're giving values here, but we don't expect all of the activity that we're showing to be mitigable. It's only going to be a relatively small proportion of what we're showing that will be truly mitigable. And kind of related to that, it's also important with this to consider that there is this risk of post hoc rationalisation. We're looking at this data retrospectively and looking at activity and saying potentially this could be avoided. But actually, in lots of cases, patients will have been admitted because there was a significant clinical risk at the time. And so obviously those admissions were necessary at the time. And it's only afterwards that we're looking at it that we're saying, oh, it looks to us like it's mitigable. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Also, the other thing with this is that we're using routinely collected hospital data. So using this data brings potential issues in terms of data recording and data submission. And also we do find there are just natural differences between how areas record activity. For example, we know in some areas that children attending an A&E will be assessed in A&E and that activity will be recorded in A&E. But in some areas, those children will be assessed, will be sent to a paediatric assessment unit, assessed there, and that activity can often be recorded as inpatient activity. So one of our mitigators that looks at children, for example, some of that activity might be picked up. And so that might account for some of the potential discrepancies between areas in terms of the levels of activity. And similarly also, over time, it's quite possible that areas might have changed how they're recording activity, which might impact the data.
And just finally, Sarah, you've touched on some of these things, but what next for this? Because there's a lot to this, and obviously it is it's a live piece. So what next? What are some of the areas you're looking at in terms of the work?
So we're kind of hoping that this will provide some kind of basis in which to track activity going forwards. So almost provide a bit of a baseline and a method with which we can track activity going forward. So even though at the moment our kind of mitigator categories are quite broad and they include a lot of activity, we would still expect to be able to use these to kind of track over time and hopefully see a reduction if we're getting more activity mitigated. But saying that, they are broad categories at the moment, and so we would like to try and refine these categories a bit in the future so that we can focus a little bit more specifically on the activity that we feel is truly mitigable. But yeah, that's what we'd like to do next.
Okay, Sarah, thanks so much for helping explore the detail of that. Some really useful information there, and we'll post links with the video. But for now, thanks for your time.
Thank you.